What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. Today, we have a phenomenal episode for you. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jaime Tartar. Dr. Tartar, how are you doing today?
Hi, Mike. Couldn't be better. Fantastic in the sunny South Florida. How are you?
I'm also doing well. I would prefer to be in the sunny South right now. It's a little chilly in Philadelphia, but no worries. The show must go on. Dr. Tartar, for our listeners who might not be familiar with you and your work, can you provide us with a brief introduction about yourself and your current research focus?
Sure. Well, I am a professor of neuroscience here at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. This beautiful weather that we have all year round. I'm also the research director of my college, and I am president and co-founder of an academic society for the field of sport neuroscience called the Society for Neurosports. A lot of my
Fantastic.
research, you asked about research too. So I study humans. I used to study rats, obviously when I was a postdoc, but now I study humans and I love it. So we study stress and sleep, and more recently, human performance.
And you prefer to study the humans as opposed to rats because humans are a little trickier. It's tough to control them.
It is. Well, it's really strange because, as you probably know, most neuroscientists study rats. So it's really weird to be a neuroscientist that studies humans. So for a lot of reasons, I made the switch probably back before a lot of your listeners were born. Back in 2016, I switched from rodents to humans, and it's hard because you just can't get the same level of understanding. Humans don't like it when you take off their heads and slice their brains after an experiment. But it's sort of funny when somebody comes up to my poster, or if I'm giving a presentation, like, "Oh, you're studying humans." I'm like, it's an interesting model for humans, studying humans.
I'm sure. For our discussion today, as you alluded to, we're going to be talking about sleep, and this is on the back end of a wonderful presentation you did for the ISSN about sleep. And when you introduced this presentation, you said, "Listeners, if you don't take anything away from this besides one main point, it's yes, you should be getting roughly 8 hours of sleep per night." And I think that most people know this, just like most people know they should be eating more fruits and vegetables, but unfortunately they don't for whatever reason. And today we're going to be talking about many of the adverse consequences of getting repeated nights of inadequate sleep. And by the end, some of the listeners might be asking, am I going to spontaneously combust from my sleep habits? I don't know, maybe, but
Maybe.
the primary purpose of the podcast is to provide evidence-based information. And as a consequence of that, I hope we facilitate some positive behavior change in the process. I mean, what do you think, Dr. Tartar? Is the route we're going to take, is that an effective approach to maybe get some of the listeners to improve their sleep habits?
Yeah, I think fear is a great motivator. So we can like scare them, but then if they hang on, well, maybe we'll end with some good news and what they can do to help themselves.
Excellent. So,
You can
listeners,
model to your tactics.
yeah. Listeners, things might seem down, but we're going to wrap up with a happy ending. Don't you worry. Everything's going to be great and you don't have to worry too much. But let's open up the discussion here. And before we get into the specifics, would you be able to maybe outline for the listeners some general occurrences when it comes to these adverse consequences we're going to get into? So, based on the research, does it seem like there's a certain number of days or maybe a specific amount of time where these consequences start to manifest? Can we generalize that or no?
We can generalize it somewhat, and it's the general idea. So if most of the people listening to your podcast are young, right, they don't have too much to worry about right now as far as obviously long-term consequences. What we know is that a lifetime of poor sleep hygiene and a lifetime of poor sleep habits does put you at several at risk for several diseases, such as like cancer and neurodegeneration and just poor memory in general. So these are sort of just like any lifestyle consequence, poor nutrition, not exercising. These are things that catch up with you. There will be acute effects that we can talk about, but those more deleterious disease states tend to catch up with you in the long run.
So when we're assessing this, maybe over the course of a week, for example, and if we look at perhaps the average sleep duration of the average person, because I'm not exactly aware, but I'm gonna imagine the average adult doesn't get 8 hours every
No.
night. It is the typical duration of the average individual at a point where there should be some concern for these things you mentioned?
Well, so we want to say, sort of that general caveat that just like height, there's individual differences in how much sleep people need. So, like for a girl, I'm very tall, I'm 5'11", right? So I would be outside of sort of the range of expected height. So it's just like that with sleep. On average, people do need about 8 hours of sleep. There are some individual differences where some people may need a little bit more, some people may need a little bit less, but just like height, the further you get away from that average, the rarer it is. So there are some super short sleepers that physiologically only need 6 hours of sleep, and they do fine. But that's like the 1 in 1,000, 6'5" NFL player. So the problem is everybody thinks they're that person, right? If you tally the number of people that think they can get by, everybody is 6'5" NFL player. So it's really, really rare. But we do recognize there are individual differences. So I would just say, expect that you need 8 hours of sleep a night. Try to get it. And if you have a chance to, which is rare, but if you have a chance to go on vacation or have a time where you don't have to get up, after about a week of sort of what we talk about as free running, you can start to find your free running rhythm. Go to bed without an alarm clock, wake up without an alarm clock. And that kind of gives you an indication of how many hours you need.
Great. Yeah, I can certainly attest to that. I would say the majority of people I run into, they're like, no, I'm definitely one of those people. I only need like 6 hours and I'm
Yeah.
firing on all cylinders. And it's just like with in the fine print, firing on all cylinders with 600 milligrams of caffeine. I'm like, oh, all right, you got this under control.
Well, and I think, to your point, it's not sleeping enough is a lot like being intoxicated. You don't know. You're not aware that you're having problems. And this has been demonstrated over and over in my own lab. We've demonstrated this. People think they're fine. It's when you objectively test them that they're not okay. So we're not good at determining whether we're suffering from the neurocognitive consequences of sleep loss. Maybe the people around us know.
Yeah. Excellent. And we'll certainly get into a few of those things there. For the listeners who, might not have that long-term mindset and they're thinking to themselves, well, it'll be fine. Like I don't care how my poor sleep affects me in 30 years, but we do have a lot of practitioners and athletes that listen in and they do care about these short-term effects, particularly when it comes to body composition, right? So when it comes to trying to lose fat and build muscle, right? Body recomposition, that's the ultimate goal of every person you're ever going to encounter in the fitness industry. We do care about how poor sleep might affect the outcomes over an 8 to 12 week diet or something similar, something short term. So, could you outline for the listeners some of the research on this topic when it comes to the effects of repeated inadequate sleep on energy intake? So, when people don't get enough sleep, are there changes in hunger or changes in cravings that might make sticking to an energy deficit more difficult?
Yeah, and I think what you said is exactly right. And when people don't get enough sleep on average, so most people aren't going through sleep deprivation, right? So what a lot of us succumb to is something called chronic sleep restriction, is that we're not getting enough sleep over and over and over and over again. And so that's been pretty well studied. My lab, we did a study looking at total sleep, just one night of total sleep deprivation, and we found significant increases in the hunger hormone, ghrelin, decreases in leptin. But even if you give somebody a 2-week chronic sleep restriction, so you take sleep away from people, about 2 hours sleep, take them from 8 to 6 hours of sleep, they're going to have about a 6% increase in food intake. And that's despite what's interesting is that even 2 weeks of chronic sleep restriction is enough for people to gain about 2 pounds, about a kilogram, even though they have about a 5% increase in metabolic use. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because you would think the more time you spend in wakefulness, you're actually having more metabolic demand, therefore you lose weight. It turns out that's not the case. The more time that you spend awake, there's a whole series of physiological consequences to that. So one, again, lots of labs have shown this. One of the first consequences will be an increase in ghrelin. So you're going to feel hungrier. And what's interesting is if you follow these people, it's not just that they're hungrier, but they tend to have a specific appetite for carbohydrates. We see a concomitant reduction in insulin sensitivity as well, and sort of increases in insulin resistance go concomitantly with that. Some glucose impairment. So there does seem to be a basic metabolic change in ways that I think, especially with sort of the changes to glucose that we don't completely understand yet, but it's very clear that sleep loss is associated with weight gain through these basic metabolic changes and changes to hunger hormones, with the observation that people do tend to eat carbs when they're not sleeping a lot. Not that carbs are bad, right? Carbs are
Right, right.
fine, but they're maybe over consuming them. They're consuming a lot of foods that are high in sugar as well, just general sugar, like the stuff my kids eat, candy, things like that.
Yeah, we're definitely fond of carbohydrates on the podcast, so no need to worry there. So, as you outlined, there are these definitive changes
Mhm.
in ghrelin, but also it seems to be there's some subjective changes, right? So, certain foods become more appealing, and then I think coinciding with this and something you've done a lot of research in terms of how the brain is working is that in terms of decision making, right? There's this increase in risky behavior, or perhaps we're not being as rational or patient with how we're making decisions. And maybe that is also driving. So we have this increase in physiological hunger, but then we also become more attracted to these hyperpalatable, energy dense foods as a consequence of sleep restriction. Would that be correct?
Right. I mean, like millions of years of evolution have ensured that we're going to crave high fat, high calorie foods, right? The people who crave broccoli didn't make it, right? So high fat, high calorie foods is good for you, especially if you're an early human. And we have to work against that. We have unlimited access to high fat, high calorie food. So most of the time we're inhibiting and we're self-regulating and not overeating these foods. But you're exactly right. When we decrease our ability to inhibit those behaviors, it makes it much, much riskier. And so we did show, and we need to publish this. You're going to motivate me to write it up. We did show one of the consequences of sleep loss is increased risk-taking behavior, increased risky behavior. Because we want to recognize that when you lose sleep, one of the first things to go is your neurobehavioral performance. So you're going to lose, especially attention, your ability to pay attention to something for a long time, but also those emotional factors. And what we and others have shown is you get a little bit of emotional instability. And in my lab, we specifically showed that sort of subcortical part of your brain that you don't necessarily have conscious access to isn't agreeing with that sort of conscious emotional part of your brain. So there does seem to be a disconnect between what that subcortical limbic emotion system is doing, despite what you know consciously. So we see a little bit of emotional instability as well with sleep loss. And all of these things play into decision making and going for that, extra slice of chocolate cake.
For sure. And when we talk about this emotional instability or maybe being in a, a poor mood because of the lack of sleep, then also maybe that these tasty things are really driving that reward response and just making you, happier, and not even realizing that your mood is below baseline and you have this increased reward response, just making you want to eat some of these foods even more so.
Right. It's just better, I guess it's a general understanding that we think of our brain, so that moment to moment reality, as that, oh, this is me, I live in this moment. But the reality is your brain is like the biggest confabulator ever. Like it just makes things up all the time. So we're sometimes aware of why we're making the decisions that we are, but usually by the time we've made that decision, it's already been processed below our conscious awareness. So your brain is just, it's driving you. It's not the other way around. So there is, a disc. So we just want to recognize that most of the processing happening in your brain is happening even below your awareness. So it takes a lot of effort on behalf of that, that prefrontal cortex to sort of maintain control of the vehicle. So you put a human in a vulnerable state, like with sleep loss or stress, and some of these processes don't become driven as well.
Absolutely. I've had the opportunity to gain some of that insight through Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with Daniel Kahneman. Yeah, he's a really famous psychologist.
Yeah, and he kind of talks about like first brain and second brain and how like basically we are always registering this information. We have these automatic responses and it's just like you don't acknowledge it. So exactly like to your point, right? Like we do these things and whether we're aware of it or not, like we have these automatic responses all the time to what's going on in our environment.
Right. Yeah. It's fascinating. It's the big question in neuroscience, consciousness. So that's a whole nother podcast.
For sure. Now, similar to this topic of the effect of a lack of sleep on energy intake, is there a good amount of data showing the effects of a lack of sleep on weight loss effectiveness? So this is related, but slightly different. So I guess what I'm getting at with weight loss effectiveness is the goal is to lose fat and retain as much muscle as possible. We're in an energy deficit, right? So might a lack of sleep potentially change this ratio or make it more unfavorable?
Yeah, I mean, it's just bad news all around, right? I have nothing good to say about not sleeping a lot. So we talked about this idea that your sort of hormones get dysregulated. We want to recognize that. So we were talking about ghrelin and leptin, but your internal clock in your brain. So if I like took, it's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, right? SCN. So, if I took that out of your brain, I wouldn't do it because we're friends. If I took that out of your brain and I buried it in, underground, it came back in 20 years, it would still be on your rhythm, whatever that is, a 24-hour or so rhythm. And these internal clocks help to regulate hormone release in the hypothalamus, which is responsible for all of our releasing and inhibiting hormones are released from the hypothalamus, and they tell the pituitary to go ahead and release hormones like growth hormone or gonadotropin releasing hormone, which ultimately releases testosterone. So things like testosterone and growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1, are critical for growth, especially muscle maintenance, muscle growth, when you're trying to build muscle, hypertrophy. And so testosterone is regulated along a circadian rhythm, just like everything else. Growth hormone is as well. And testosterone bursts at night appear to be linked to REM sleep cycles. And growth hormone is maximally released at night, and growth hormone induces IGF-1 levels. And so IGF-1 is one of those hormones. It's produced in the liver, but it's a hormone that signals to your body, okay, go ahead and you can have hypertrophy now. You can build muscle. And if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not releasing enough growth hormone, and you're not getting those testosterone bursts that are released with REM sleep cycles. And nobody who's going through wanting to increase lean muscle is going to want to have that happen. So we just want to recognize, even in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it really is important for helping to regulate these hormone release through the hypothalamus, but it also connects directly to your liver and pancreas. So, glucose and insulin, those are going to be affected once the SCN is dysregulated. So it's that other idea of like get enough sleep, but you also want to go to bed and get up like around the sleep time every day, make sure that you've got that great healthy circadian alignment. So sleep for gains, right? I guess would be the
I think that's certainly the take home or the message we're trying to get across in this one, right? So everyone's looking for the next big supplement to augment increases in strength and size. And it's like, okay, well, creatine. Well, what else is there? And it's like, all right, caffeine pre-workout. And it's like, what else do we got? And it's like, give me another supplement. And it's like, yeah, and it's like supplement an extra hour of sleep each night, and it's free. That is your supplement of choice.
yeah. And so we have to. So my friend that I work with here, she works in clinical sleep medicine, and so we talk about this idea that prescribing what's called sleep extension to people, and she's a clinician, so she actually works with clients on this. And we can't force people to go to bed, right? That's impossible. But we can force time in bed. So she'll prescribe 9 hours time in bed. Even though we call it sleep extension, it really just gets people to 8 hours. It doesn't like give them, just gets people up to where they should be.
I love that sleep extension sound. It sounds unique. It sounds exciting, right? It's just like, oh, well, looking at everything, your baseline. How about we consider sleep extension? It's like, oh, whoa, what's that? That sounds new.
Sounds fancy. So yeah, what you'll do is you just prescribe a certain number of hours of time in bed without all these other devices around. And people generally, when they're in bed for 9, when you're forced to be in bed without TV, and if you can do that, you'll sleep more because you have nothing else to do. And there's other things that go with that, like not associating your bed with activities. You can have sex in your bed, that's fine. But like you don't want to be watching TV and doing all these other things where your brain starts to associate bed with being awake.
Fantastic. Yeah, we alluded to a couple of these main sleep hygiene practices, and we'll eventually come back to more of those in the end. Something I want to move into here is the effects of sleep on the gut microbiome. So, you recently published a great article on
Well,
this.
thank you.
And as we get into the nuances of this piece, perhaps we can begin by explaining this relationship between the brain and the gut and why this is so important and just frankly fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really lucky that I have some good friends here at NSU. Like my good friend Joe Lopez, he has a lab where he can process the samples because he does a lot of microbiome work. He looks at like ocean microbiome, really interesting things. And my other friend's a systems biologist, so we can look at the whole system. And that's what we were really interested in doing, is looking at not just sleep, but sleep and the immune system and sort of stress hormones and cognition and emotion, and just trying to see how all these things were connected. And it was just in men. We were a little bit limited, and we didn't have the funds to start looking at estrogen, so we limited to men for that first initial study. And we did show a really interesting relationship where, as sleep, and we had people wear actigraphy, sort of like that little Apple Watch on steroids. So they does a really good job of looking at things like sleep efficiency, total time asleep, time in bed, wake after sleep onset. And so all of these sleep measures were related back to gut microbiome. And what we were really interested in was the richness and diversity of the gut microbiome. So as sleep went down, gut microbiome health went down as well. And for us, it's really important to recognize is that because this was we followed people for 30 days, we don't know the directionality of this relationship. So we don't know if what the causal role is. Is it poor gut microbiome health that causes poor sleep, or is it the other way around? And so we're actually planning that follow-up study right now. And we're hoping to, now that our coronavirus numbers are down, we think we can start testing people as soon as May. So we're really excited to sort of show the direction.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Within this paper, and I believe you mentioned this like hypothesis of sorts in the previous presentation, and that is the role of interleukin 6, right? And I believe you stated that you think like this is the major player when it comes to these consequences and these changes that we're seeing. So maybe provide for the listeners what exactly is going on with IL-6, why it's important, and why hypothetically it could be the most valuable player in these scenarios.
Yeah, I always gotta be careful when I try to predict things. It has IL-6 has, like a lot of cytokines, but IL-6 in particular has pleiotropic effects throughout the body, and it's really interesting because it's a cytokine, but it's also a myokine. It's anti-inflammatory and it's pro-inflammatory, and it's just, in my experience, pretty much every study I do, this particular immune factor keeps coming up as something that seems to be a linchpin of sorts. And it's at the point where if I have to gamble on somebody, like if I only had money to, which is really the case coming up in a study that we're about to do, when I only have a little bit of money and I have to be really careful about what I'm going to measure, CRP certainly, but IL-6 is my go-to guy because I just see it, interleukin 6 coming up over and over and over again. And in this particular study, it was related just to everything. It was really the linchpin factor that seemed to be not just related to our grouping of sleep measures, but also to gut microbiome measures in sort of a positive correlational way. And also to some of these cognitive measures, neurobehavioral performance that we were measuring. So I don't know causally, but certainly we will be able to show that in this follow-up study and in a couple other follow-up studies that we're looking at now. So I'm really interested in the future of IL-6. I wish I could invest in stock. I don't think it works that way.
For these follow-up studies, what is your hypothesis sticking to you being able to predict things? Do
You
you
want me to
think
say it out loud and then I'm going to be wrong, and then I come back on, I'm going to look stupid.
the role of science is not being right all the time.
I'm always wrong.
Yeah, we want to be wrong, right? We want to disprove our hypothesis and evolve, and it's okay if we're right now and then wrong later, as long as we're continuously getting
I don't even
better
care
at
if I'm
being
right or
right.
wrong. What I care about is I get a p-value below 0.05.
I completely understand where you're coming from there, but what would your hypothesis be? Is it that diversity, a poor microbiome diversity is driving the difficulty sleeping, or would it be that the lack of sleep is reducing the diversity of the gut microbiome?
So I think it's sleep. And so what we're going to do, we're actually going to do something good, I think, because when we test I work at a university, so it's really easy to find young, healthy people. But when you find young, healthy people, they sleep horribly. College students sleep
Yeah.
6 hours a night on average. So what we were going to do is go in that other direction that we talked about. We're going to extend their sleep instead of taking, because every study I do is that we take away sleep and we see, oh my God, this is awful. So I kind of want to go in that other direction for once. So we want to look at their microbiome diversity, inflammation measures, all these things, recruiting specifically objectively studied poor sleepers. So we're going to follow them for 30 days and get the worst of the worst. And then we're going to give them counseling, sleep extension protocol. And what I think is going to happen is I think we're going to see specifically changes in inflammation, and those changes in inflammation are going to result in better, healthier gut microbiome diversity. So I think by improving sleep, we'll improve gut microbiome diversity. I mean, it's a hard study because we have to control for a lot of things. And one of the most important things we have to control for is their diet. So we've got to have them do a nutrition log every day. But if we're ready, we're ready. We can do this.
I'm looking forward to those
Humans are different. This is why it's easy. Can you imagine this study would be so much
yeah.
easier to do in a rat?
Yeah, exactly. I understand how difficult it can be recruiting subjects for these sorts of things. But as you mentioned, when it comes to university and when I reflect on my time at university, I feel like it shouldn't be too hard, right? Because like if you look at the extremes, some people are spending too much time studying and they
Mhm.
might be only getting 5 6 hours. But then you got the other people who don't care about studying whatsoever, and they're probably also only getting 5 to 6 hours. So hopefully we have enough of a sample size to pick from
Well,
here.
I think we'll have a good sample size. What always makes me nervous is that what the participants don't realize is you have so much riding on their behavior. And you want to say like, oh, please, you tell them like, please, extend your sleep. And, we're measuring this. And then you're like, please don't change your diet. And you're like following them and you see that they're not doing it. Luckily, I think most people want to help and they're mostly following, but you'll see like some people, it's the people that don't do the study that you kind of lose, that you're like, oh, it hurts.
Absolutely. I think here is when we start transitioning to giving people some hope, some strategies to work
Oh,
with to improve their habits. And let's start with some people who might be thinking to themselves, yes, I've been aware that getting 8 hours of sleep per night would be ideal, but it's just not happening for me during the week. And like there's nothing I can do. We just won't get it accomplished. So for these people, is it possible to make up for the sleep debt they accrued during the work week on the weekend? Hey guys, Mike here. If you're interested in learning more about how to maximize your health, body composition, and performance, head over to hammerawayfitness.com where you can sign up for coaching or even just schedule an hour consult with me to get some of your training and nutrition questions answered. Also, if you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, and would like to further support the growth of the Muscle Memoirs podcast, you can give a donation to the link in the show notes, leave us a review, and or share this episode with your friends, whether that be dropping the link in a group chat or putting a screenshot in your Instagram story. I truly appreciate it.
If you accrue a sleep debt during the week, when you pay off that sleep debt, your emotion and like cognitive, so your neurobehavioral functioning will be fine the next day. So you can get that back. But that lifetime, the metabolic consequences, you can't really get that back, because one of the things we didn't talk about was this idea that one of the other things that happens during sleep is you clean out the metabolic waste products, and you do that during the deepest stages of sleep. So beta amyloid, the protein product associated with Alzheimer's disease, alpha-synuclein, these detrimental products, metabolic waste products that build up during the day, you need deep sleep to get rid of them. And so this is where we get into a lifetime of poor sleep is associated with neurodegenerative functioning. And those things, it's slow, but chronic sleep restriction, doing this for 20 or 30 years is just such a bad idea. you should sleep normally, like 8 hours. It's not worth it.
You probably might not have realized this, but I was the one who asked this question during the webinar, and
Oh,
you provided a really nice example comparing this to consuming alcohol.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Yeah. So it's just like, right, if you drink a lot at night, if you're drinking alcohol, you'll be fine. It's a lifetime consequences of drinking alcohol where you start to see memory impairments, and not only that, but your all your memories are consolidated during sleep, including motor memory. So if you're even trying to learn a new movement sequence, you gotta sleep. So I think sometimes we just have to give. It's also societal, right? So we value not sleeping a lot. So if I come into work and I'm like, oh, I've been working so hard, I'm only sleeping 6 hours a night, like that sounds really good. But if I come to work and I tell my boss, like, oh, I'm really happy and healthy and I'm sleeping like solid 9 hours, we don't value that. And it's sort of silly because your boss should want you sleeping a lot. So I think we need to change kind of our mindset on how we think about sleep.
Yeah, I think that's extremely well said. If we can't make up for it on the weekends, what if an individual perhaps has a 30 to 60-minute gap in the middle of their day during the week where they could squeeze in a nap? If they're consistently getting 5 to 6 hours of sleep per night, could they perhaps attenuate any of these consequences by squeezing in a nap in the middle of the day, or is it a little more complicated?
It's a little more complicated because of what we talk about as sleep architecture. So it's not like you go to sleep and you're doing like 8 hours. You're going through different stages in very specific ways. So during the first part of the night, you spend more time in slow wave sleep. And as you get closer to morning, you cycle and you spend more time in REM sleep. And you have to go through that consolidated 8 hours of sleep. So you can't really, there's not really any shortcuts. You can't break it up and get 2 here and 3 there. But that being said, your naps are perfectly healthy unless if you take a nap in the after, especially when cortisol drops around 4 p.m. for most of us, we get sleepy. So, a little nap is fine. It's just if that's impairing you from sleeping those consolidated 8 hours, and maybe it's not such a good idea. But if you can take a nap during, because naps are great. Naps also help to consolidate emotional memory and non-emotional memory. So that's the other thing that happens during sleep, right? You during REM sleep, that REM rich sleep in particular, you're getting sort of emotional memory consolidation. And there's even a lot of evidence to suggest that that helps you deal with the next day emotional activities and helps you deal with emotional events the next day. So that happens in the morning. So waking up too early really puts you at risk for not being able to process your daytime emotional activities and interactions. So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, napping is good, but it doesn't take, you can't trade.
No, it makes complete sense, and I appreciate that context. I think I may have, suggested to the listeners that things were turning up, but this may or may not be disheartening. Our takeaway here is that there are no shortcuts.
There's no
You got to get that
shortcuts.
8 hours.
Yeah, because it's the duration of sleep, it's the quality of sleep, right? It's all of this matters. But the good news is that if you just if you spend an hour a day or 2 hours a day at the gym and you think that's time well invested, then you should also think that time sleeping for repair and restoration is valuable as well. I think it's that most people don't think of sleep as time well spent, but we spend a third of our lives asleep. All the animals sleep, and if it wasn't important, I mean, this would be the biggest mistake evolution ever made, right? Like, because we're not doing things that would help keep us alive, right? We're not mating, we're not hunting for food, we're vulnerable to predation. So we need it, and we know more and more why we need it. So I think we want to give ourselves, I guess the good news is that you can give yourself permission to sleep and really think of sleep just as important as brushing your teeth and eating healthy, all these other things that we do to stay healthy and active, and we can't shortcut sleep. But the other good news is that we are also in control of how we sleep more than we think. And one of the things that we talked about with on the ISSN talk was this idea of regulating your light. Being very careful about light regulation at night is an excellent way to help feel sleepy. There's little cells in your eyes that respond only to light and tell you it's it's daytime or nighttime. Dropping your temperature at night is an excellent way. Dropping body temperatures, if you have air conditioning, drop it down. That change in temperature at night is another excellent way to help your body fall asleep at night. And then the good news is sleep is ergogenic, right? So think of sleep as a way of superpowering yourself. We just said it's going to help your appetite. It's going to help you think better. It's going to help you be emotionally better. It's going to help you get muscles. So this is like the hidden superpower that you have is sleep.
Perhaps some other good news that came to mind. You mentioned the gym there, and you recently published another study, right? You were part of looking at the effect of the time of day when the individual was training and the effect on sleep later on. So could you elaborate on those results real quick for the listeners?
Sure, this was a study, Victoria Burgess, this was her PhD work. And yeah, we were really interested in this because people anecdotally say don't exercise at night because it's bad for sleep. It hasn't really been studied. So we did the same thing. I'd given her those like Apple Watches on steroids, and we followed people's sleep, whether they were assigned AM or PM exercise. And it didn't matter. If you work out in the morning or you work out at night, it has absolutely no effect on your sleep, which makes sense because, again, some of these cytokines that are released during exercise also help to induce sleepiness, like IL-1 beta. So some of these little small changes in inflammation can actually be beneficial. So exercise in general helps sleep, and it helps with deep sleep in particular. But what we showed is if you're a morning exerciser or an evening exerciser, it's not going to affect your anything, sleep quality, sleep duration, how many times you wake after sleeping. So there was no difference between these groups. And as an evening exerciser, I was really happy to see that.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. And referring to those common anecdotes of not training at night, and this might be related to this sympathetic state, right? And how it's going to become hard to wind down and fall asleep. And I understand where people might be coming from with that logic. But then also, I think, like, man, like after I train legs, like I'm trashed and like the rest of my day is negatively affected. So, like, if I just trained at night, like I just go right to sleep after.
Right. Yeah. And I think like what you're saying is there is a lot of individual differences. So there's probably some people who maybe can't train at night, maybe some people who can't train during, but on average, we saw no difference because as scientists, we talk about averages. We ignore those error bars all the time. So we're always talking in terms of the average person. But I think especially some of those, inflammatory markers that are released are going to help some people, probably more than others, feel sleepy.
For sure. You mentioned a few sleep hygiene tips throughout our discussion, and that is, going to bed and waking up at the same time each day, sleeping in a cool room, reserving the bed for specific activities such as sleep. Um, with all of those, I don't know if perhaps those stick out or there are others which you haven't touched on yet, but in this laundry list of sleep hygiene practices, which ones do you think are the most underutilized that people might be aware of, but they really could benefit from prioritizing these maybe one or two?
I think the number one, and I think even though people know it, I don't think they understand how important is light, especially blue light, because again, through that, the retinal hypothalamic tract is the tract that regulates melatonin and your circadian rhythms. So there are things called Zeitgebers, which means like timekeeper, and this is it. Like your light is the strongest one, and this is one of those instances where our biology hasn't caught up with our technology. And one of the best things that you can do, and I do this too. I have a blue light generator in my office, not now because it would look weird. I turned it off for you. So, and if you work indoors, you want to make sure you're getting that sort of natural sunlight or an artificial sunlight, like what I have, during the day, especially when you wake up in the morning, and you maybe taper that off. And then in the afternoon, you want to start thinking about how much light you're getting. And at night, you want to, as much as possible, be in dim light. And I also take two supplements. I take melatonin and creatine, right? So I take melatonin at night just to supplement because I have kids and they have lots of devices. But that retinal hypothalamic tract that regulates suprachiasmatic nucleus, that internal clock, which regulates all of your hormones and also regulates melatonin levels. And we talked about this idea that, light at night is even considered a carcinogen because there's so many deleterious effects to light at night. So number one, I think that's it. And I'm not like in, big light. They're not paying me to say any of this. And temperature, I think, is underutilized. Hunter-gatherer populations that have been studied sleep when the temperature drops. They don't always sleep right when it gets dark out. So dropping your temperature at night, or finding some way to drop your core body temperature helps you go to sleep. And then the other thing is, which is a problem for us, is caffeine. was that like a 6-hour half-life? So you like, I'm going to stop. But, like, we don't want to drink. And, we, in our lab, we're also studying sort of genetic polymorphisms to caffeine sensitivity, because some people are just more sensitive due to a couple of SNPs than other people. So caffeine. And then the hardest thing for all of us is probably the number one cause of insomnia is anxiety, which is, I wish I had something in my pocket that I could just give people, but especially now, so many people are struggling with negative thoughts and anxiety. And I would just suggest that if that's the case, just like we have some weird thoughts in our society about sleep, we also have weird thoughts about talking to people. But definitely reaching out and talking to even psychologists, they're there to help everyday people with everyday problems. So getting worries under control, even if that means talking to somebody, because I can say get worries under control, but that's it's really hard to do. So, I think if you having anxiety, it's okay to reach out, and we should be more comfortable with that.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think those are all tremendous points, especially about the exposure to light, right? As you mentioned, people don't fully understand this. And I think that's completely true in the fact that blue light blocker glasses are trendy right now. And maybe people might put on some sort of light setting on their phone at night. They might go in the night mode and they think about that. But I don't see a lot of people considering how much light exposure they're getting during the day,
Mhm.
or making a part of their daily routine. Hey, I better get outside for 20 minutes and get some direct sunlight during the day.
Yeah, it's really important. Or if you work in a silly office building like me, Amazon sells great little light. Again, I'm not in big light. Every time I do a podcast or talk, I always get an email like, "Are you selling?" Or you're in big, big pharma. I'm like, I wish. Give me some of that pharma money.
In terms of big light, do you have any general recommendations there? Like, are all of these like lamp products similarly effective, or is it really only like the higher end ones get the job done?
No, I think anything that you can do to emulate as much as possible daylight. I have one with 3 settings just so I can turn it down during the day. But I think your idea is fantastic. It's just getting out and getting into that nature, and taking a walk. I don't know if you've heard, there's a lot of other research on sort of forest bathing and sort of the benefits to the immune system of just being in nature in general. And there's other research to suggest that when you have a meeting, taking a walking meeting is even better, because it seems to help the productivity of the meeting and your thought processes. So like with these sort of walking meetings, I'm trying to do more and more, but I'm losing a lot of friends this way.
I love that point. Today is Friday, which is when the podcast usually comes out. On this day in particular, we just released an episode with Alan Levinovitz, who wrote the book Natural that recently came out, and we kind of talked about the value of experiencing nature, as well as some other things like the fascination with natural food and medicine and all that. But I do find it interesting that that point was made on today specifically.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Did he talk about that, the research with forest bathing?
I don't think directly, but we definitely talked about many things that were closely related.
Yeah, I because when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's a funny name. But then the research is there. It's really fascinating.
Awesome. Dr. Tartar, that is all I have for you today. This has been a phenomenal discussion. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. For the listeners who want to go learn more about you and support you, where can we point them towards?
So probably I'm mostly on Instagram. I have a Twitter, but I'm really bad at Twitter. So we're at Society for Neurosports on Instagram, and you can go there in our website, neurosports.net. And you can find out more about our upcoming conference. You can register for the conference and see all of our awesome speakers. Um, so those are probably the best 2 places.
I strongly encourage everyone to check out the conference. There will be a link in the show notes to register. Fantastic line of speakers. If you enjoyed this episode, you're going to enjoy the conference even more. So, everyone, go and check it out. But that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
Okay, thanks, Mike.